So I'm bi. How about you? Asks Jonathan Kent, son of Clark Kent and Lois Lane, and now the man who carries the mantle of Superman in DC Comics. I guess I've only ever dated women, but I mean, look at me, seriously, look at me, I'm gorgeous. I'm an absolute snack. I've got to be at least a little queer. Answers Dick Grayson, adopted son of Bruce Wayne, the boy once known as Robin and now Nightwing, responds. And there's two things I want to talk about here, but the first one is obviously how impossibly triggered some loudmouth conservatives got over this, because of course they did. Hello again, I am Blunty, and man, it is always such crispy comedy when conservative types who love to claim that the libs do nothing but look for excuses to be offended. The libs are such fragile snowflakes. The libs who get swept away in groupthink and performative outrage are the fools, the clowns in this situation. But the conservative types have so little self-awareness they don't even notice they're describing themselves. Chuck Dixon is a fantastic example of this. If you're a Gen Xer or an elder millennial who read comics in your youth, you might know his name. If you're younger, well, don't worry if you haven't heard of him. Chuck hasn't been relevant in a very long time. So unless you've been digging through the back catalogues and reading some classic 90s comics, don't worry if you've never heard his name. Short version was, he was very prolific on several Batman books. He was also a co-creator of Bane. His run on Punisher was fairly well received once upon a time. And he helped boost the popularity of Nightwing from mildly relevant Batman spin-off character and put him on the path towards being a genuinely interesting character in his own right, on his own 2 feet. He was prolific, his work was respected, and then you've got Dean Cain, a well-known knobhead in general, whose one and only claim to relevance at all is being in the early 90s light drama about Superman, called Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman. So, Chuck Dixon came across the comic panel we opened with, somewhere, and decided to just repost it to Twitter, asking, "Who wants this?" Now, Chuck is well known for his outspoken conservative views, so the subtext was obvious to decode here. He was pissy at it. He was like, "Who wants this? No one could possibly want this. A Nightwing who's questioning his own sexuality? Who would possibly want this?" Blah, 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 blah. Hey, Chuck, lots of people want that. Have you taken a look around recently at your own industry? Lots and lots of people would really, really enjoy Nightwing being at least a little queer. But no, Chuck had to shake his fist at the sky, whining about how comics these days reflect the fact that queer people exist. And even people who have historically just assumed they were straight can feel free to question and examine their own sexuality in open conversation with friends and peers at any time in their life. Ask me how I know this. And Chuck, I promise you, this is a thing that happens in real life. A lot. Whether your dusty old ass likes it or not. So yes, it can and will be reflected in the art we make. Then Dean Cain comes along, permanently convinced people need to care about his dopey opinions on the things he says because he was in a TV show about a comic book character that people like 30 years ago. No thanks, says well-known homophobic, transphobic Dean Cain, impossibly ignorant of the fact that queer people exist, and even their straight friends talk to them about queer things sometimes. But here's the kicker. Neither Chuck nor Dean bothered to take a look around, because the comic book panel in question, wait for it, was fake. Someone, somewhere out there, edited it to make a joke. Chuck and Dean's embarrassment was compounded when the actual writer of the original comic in question, the comic that this panel comes from, Tom Taylor, responded to Chuck with the actual panel from the comic in question that he wrote, and stating with the absolute classiest mic drop I've seen in a long while, "Hey Chuck, that's not the dialogue. Someone photoshopped it for the usual outrage nonsense, but I want to say thank you so much for all you and Scott McDaniel did for Nightwing." I really appreciate he shouted out Scott McDaniel there as well, because it wasn't just Chuck who helped boost Nightwing back up into relevance, well, not even back up into relevance, but to relevance, but also the artistry of Scott McDaniel. Chuck, of course, didn't bother to learn from this experience in being corrected, in being asked to question his own behavior. He didn't self-reflect. He didn't enter into an open and earnest discussion about his assumptions and what that says, or his willingness to just believe any old shit he finds on Facebook just so he can be mad about it in public. No. Chuck, crippled with embarrassment about being so easily tricked, just deleted the post and pretended it doesn't exist. Ha! Problem solved. But he only deleted it after he had already spent hours upon hours of his little life copy-pasting a response to everyone else who was out there telling him it was fake. You know, people who had actually read the comic in question and knew that's not what the dialogue was. People with, I don't know, a hint of, what's the word I'm looking for? Dignity? Self-awareness, perhaps? But no, instead Chuck was out there, it's fake? Well, the fact that we even have to question if this is fake or not speaks volumes. Yeah, Chuck, it does. It does speak volumes about you. Volumes and volumes about you and the type of person you are. People who live in the real world, he says, gesturing to a low-poly Hall of Justice. The real world. We have conversations with people. We learn about them. We talk to them. We ask them questions. We learn to relate to them. We learn what we have in common. We learn how we are different, and we learn from all of that. And we don't freak out about stuff like this, where it's like, what if Nightwing was a little bit queer? The fact that you, Chuck, just assumed... You don't even care if it's fake, let's be honest, because it gave you an excuse to dog whistle your hate-filled views out. You don't give a crap whether or not it was fake. You just wanted something to point at and scream about. And even if the panel was real, what the hell is wrong with it in the first place? I have been in conversations like this. They happen. This is honest. But Chuck, like every other outrage merchant who doesn't actually care, they just want to snatch attention by screaming at things to get other people, ignorant people, angry about, because furious engagement is all they care about. He doesn't want art to reflect the real world. And he said this many times in many different ways, by the way. I'm not just pulling this out of my ass. I'll tell you about him in a second, just a few of them. But he wants to suppress anything he doesn't like. Like, for example, queer people. He doesn't want the conversation to happen. He wants to spark a mob of angry morons who will get angry about a comics panel in a comic they've never actually read. Because if they did read it, they would know that's not the comic panel from the book. That's not what was published. But of course, Chuck has prattled on about how his right-wing views put him at risk of being cancelled, which for normal people is the stand-in word that conservative use for being asked to take responsibility for the things they do and say, which they don't like doing because that would require them to think about the things they do and say. But Chuck once warbled, "You can only be cancelled if you give in to the mob and apologise," which, no, Chuck, that's not how any of this works. Oh my God. And the fact you're so resistant towards self-examination at all in the first place, out of fear, out of terror that you might discover you owe someone an apology for being a cockhammer towards them, is very, very telling indeed. "Anybody offended just loves getting offended, and they must be a lot of fun at Thanksgiving dinner," says Chuck Dixon. Oh, the old classic, "You must be a lot of fun at parties." That's, Jesus Christ. People who say that don't go to parties, by the way. But this Chuck Dixon whining about people being offended, being joyless people, is the same Chuck Dixon who had a hissy fit over things like making comics that reflect feminist politics, or an examination of The Punisher and how his character is reflected within the context of current events and opinions, claiming that Marvel hates the character they spent millions of dollars to make 2 seasons of a TV show about for Netflix, claiming they're embarrassed about cops liking The Punisher. Cops who should ideally stand for law and order and the performance of things like legal rights and due process, fawning over a literal serial-killing, sociopathic, hyper-violent vigilante. Yeah, I should say that's not an ideal situation, mate. I don't think cops should be idolizing The Punisher. And if I was in charge of that brand, as Marvel is, well, Disney these days, I would be embarrassed to see cops plastering that all over their cars and their uniforms. So way to miss the point, Chuck. That's some true boomer brain nonsense to imagine that cops idolizing Frank Castle the Punisher is actually a super awesome thing that is normal and should happen. And that would be a good thing for society. Or how about when Chuck gets mad at the fact sometimes creative teams will change up the race or gender of a character, sometimes even both, in order to shift the frame of reference so they can explore some new ideas from an otherwise familiar and well-explored framework. You know, what some might call the artistic process. But old crusty Chuck just imagines it's all a conspiracy to erase white people instead. Good old replacement theory, the aperitif of the white supremacist's public mask. Hey Chuck, do you honestly want to know why it's almost always a traditionally white male character getting the race and gender swap treatment? It's because for decades and decades, there has been an overwhelming majority of them. So there's way more of them to choose from. So instead of reducing the amount of minorities reflected in our media by making them white, or by making a female character male instead, it is instead far more common and acceptable to pick from the numberless amount of straight white male characters and toy with them instead, and still barely affect the overall balance of how outnumbered everyone else is by the white male cishet. The statistical math is not difficult on this one, Chuck, you boomer-ass halfwit. If you can't be honest about this much, you're not even worth engaging with in good faith, because you have no good faith in this discussion. But yeah, mate, anybody offended just loves getting offended, right? Well done on having zero self-awareness or critical thinking capacity of your own situation. Poor, out of touch Chuck. Pity the thrashing decay of the boomer brain, panicking at the thought of not oppressing and suppressing public knowledge and discussion of minorities. What a tragic, hopeless, miserable future they imagine, where people just get to be people. Now, how about that second thing I mentioned at the start? I guess I've only ever dated women, but I mean, look at me, seriously, look at me. I'm gorgeous. I'm an absolute snack. I've got to be at least a little queer. That's the joke of it, by the way, for anyone with even half an eye on the comics. There is a long-standing in-joke, I guess, about how sexy Nightwing is, and in particular on objectifying his nice bum. There is so much Nightwing bum worship, both in the fandom and in the actual comics, which have been reflecting the way the fandom has been talking about Nightwing's bum. And it has been going on for a very long time now. Sometimes it's just a throwaway gag, sometimes it's even as a commentary or reflection on how overtly sexually objectified so many female superheroes are in the medium. But the thing that pings me wrong about the execution of this little gag here is the suggestion that just because Nightwing is sexy has to mean that he should be at least a little bit queer. Because that's not how it works. And gag or not, it weirdly reinforces some harmful stereotypes about vanity, about objectifying physicality in queer spaces, about reducing queerness to revolve around physical sexiness. Issues that are not exclusive to the queer experience, by the way, but it does seem particularly prevalent in queer spaces, at least some. Which is why the conservative types so frequently come back to thinking about queer stuff as only being about sex. This is the kind of evidence they use to demonstrate that opinion. It's not about the lived experience. It's not about romance. It's not about connection to other people. It's about sex. They love to really focus on that. So I think that's part of why this feels a bit weird to me, really. And I'm not going to go on about it very much. I'm not, offended by it. I'm not going to make it a thing. But it did hit me a bit weird. And I don't know. Worth having a think about anyway, which is what art should do. Trigger thought. Not outrage, not reactionary horse crap, but thought, consideration, self-reflection. If I was making this gag, might have done the gag like this, which is essentially the same gag but reframed slightly to avoid that sort of problematic angle that I was viewing it from. Is that better? I don't know. You tell me if that's better. At the very least, talking about this is going to be a much more productive discussion than trying to get Chuck to open his crusted over eyes and see the world for what it is. Anyway, that's it. I've had my say. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you as always to the patrons scrolling up above there. I am Blunty. I will catch you next time. And did I say thank you for watching already? I think I did. Thank you again for watching. You made it to the end. Hooray! Only a percentage of you do that. Goddamn TikTok attention spans.